All right, so the time is now 2:05, and we're actually just going to go ahead and get started now. Once again, my name is Alex Brown, Communications and Outreach Specialist with the OST office. Um, Today's workshop is the Logic Model One-on-One training. It would actually be facilitated by Tristan Kirkman. Today, we are joined by our colleagues, Deborah Eichenbaum, the Grants Management Specialist, Kevin Cataldo, the Manager for Youth for the Institute for Youth Development, Renee Abdullah, uh, the technical assistant for the Youth Institute for Youth Development, and then also uh, Tristan Kirkman, the data analyst for the OSC, actually be facilitating this training today. As always, if you have any questions or concerns throughout the meeting, please feel free to enter them into the chat box, and we'll address them once it gets situated or once the time is available. And with that, I will pass it over to Tristan. Tristan, you're on mute, buddy.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you. All right. This is Logic Model 101. I'm Tristan Kirkman, your facilitator for today. And let's go ahead and get this started. So Kevin, can you go on to the next slide, please? So Alex already introduced everybody here. We're glad you're here as well. And next slide, please. So some quick norms for the session. We encourage you to use the text box and the question and answer section of WebEx to, if you have any questions. When you're doing that, if you're in the chat, please make sure what you're sending is going to all panelists option so that all of us can see it. We also ask that you engage in this and be open to learning and sharing. We're doing this for your benefit and for everybody else's benefit. Next slide, please. All right, so today, this presentation is focused on program logic models. Our goal for this presentation is to provide you with an understanding of how to develop a program logic model and also how to use a logic model in ways that will be valuable to your program. We want the information presented here to be more than just something that will just satisfy a compliance requirement. We're hoping that you can use this in developing and using a logic model for your daily program operations, including your performance measurement and your program evaluation activities. And next slide, please. So today what we're going to go over is first an overview of logic models and what they are, some of the terms and definitions that are associated with logic models, how to build your own logic model, and then some tips for concluding. So before we go on to the next, before we talk about this, a quick question for all of you. I'm going to open up a poll real quick about how you guys feel about logic models already. Just to get a quick gauge of where you are at. Leave this open for another 20 or so seconds and then move forward. Alrighty. So it seems like most people are somewhat familiar with their logic model. And with that that's good to know. So we're going to go ahead and move forward from there. I think we are one slide ahead. All right. So our presentation is focused on logic models, and first we're going to talk about what a logic model is in general. So this is a picture of how your program or initiative is supposed to work. It's going to explain the strategy to how you solve particular problems. And these are explicit statements about the activities and their intended results. This is also providing a common language and common point of reference for everybody here, and is a mechanism for sharing with funders how the program will achieve the goals of the project. Next slide. So at its core, a logic model is meant to generate a clear and shared understanding of how your program is supposed to work. So it is a logical explanation of your program model. And this is meant to support program planning and improvement, and will serve as a foundation for evaluating that program. So there's also a few examples of how logic models can be used. Logic models can be used to ensure that stakeholders have a clear and shared understanding of how a program is intended to work. For example, sharing a program's logic model with a program staff can be beneficial in generating a collective sense of responsibility and accountability, as it enables staff to understand how their specific role fits into the broader context of the program. Logic models can be used to support program planning and improvement efforts. They can be used as a program management tool to help you determine how to allocate resources effectively and serve as a framework to monitor whether the program is being implemented according to that plan. And they can serve as a foundation for evaluation. Logic models can be particularly helpful during the planning stages of evaluation by helping programs determine when and what to evaluate so that your evaluation resources are used effectively and efficiently. So to get into this, we're going to first go over some general terms and definitions. So the first one that we're going to be talking about is inputs or resources. These are the resources that go into a program, including human, financial, organizational, and community resources that are available for carrying out a program's activities, funding, staff, curriculum, volunteers, and research. Next slide, please. So activities, or program activities, are the actions or events provided by you all to generate a desired outcome. Tied to this, we have dosage, which refers to the amount of time or number of activities. Services, the provision of resources, knowledge, or goods. Opportunities, which are the availability, situation, chance, or event that might not normally be an option for your attendees. Supports, interpersonal relationships that are addressed by expectation, guidance, and boundaries. And evidence-based practices, processes in which research is used to guide and inform the delivery of services and your activities. Next slide, please. So outputs. Outputs are the direct products of a program activities. Useful things involved are indicators, which are specific items of information about program success on measures of outcomes, and benchmarks or numerical goals that measure program performance against certain intervals. Outcomes are also referring to measurable, meaningful, and expected changes in the outcomes are expected changes in the program participants that result from a program's activities. These goals involved in this, so what participants will achieve at the end of the program, and targets, defined, specific, and measurable goals. So here we have a basic example of how a logic model. Logic models can be formatted in many different ways, but a common format is to be read left to right. These are read from inputs to outcomes, employing an if-then sequence among your key components. If your program has these inputs or resources, then it can carry out these activities. If your program carries out these activities, then it can produce these outputs. If your program has produced these outputs, then it will achieve these outcomes. In addition, a logic model has two sides. The process side focuses on a program's implementation or its planned work, inputs and resources, activities, and outputs, direct products. And the outcome side of the logic model describes the expected sequence of changes that the program is intended to accomplish, which can be short-term, medium-term, or long-term changes. The outcome side reflects what the difference your program intends to make. Next slide, please. So over the next 3 slides, we're going to see example logic models for 3 different organizations. Once again, these are arranged to show that a program has these inputs or resources, then it can carry out these activities. If a program carries out these activities, then it can produce these outputs. If a program has produced these outputs, then it can achieve these outcomes. So in this case, we have workshop facilitators who are available to have life skills workshops. And those life skills workshops have outputs of students developing personal checklists and having written goals. These have outcomes that lead to the importance of goal setting, time management, mid-length goals of developing written goals and having behavioral change, and in the long term, having more progress on their college and career goals. Before we move on from here, just checking in with folks. How are we doing? If you guys have any questions, now is a good time to ask them.
Yeah, Tristan, somebody has a question. I said a bit confused by outputs versus outcomes. Could you please explain it a bit further? Output being a benchmark and outcome being final results?
Yeah, sure. So we're going to cover that in a bit more detail later on. But in general, outputs are going to be the direct product of your program's activities. So those can be, so if you have, say, evaluation forms or specific activities that are being accomplished, the outputs are a direct result of those activities, and they're immediately after that. Outcomes occur in the future and are generally involving changes in knowledge, behavior, or status of your participants in the long, middle, and short term. But we're going to go over that in a lot more detail in a little bit.
Okay, great. And then another question is, will you be sharing the PowerPoint slides with participants at the conclusion of the event?
Absolutely, we will.
Okay. And then we have another question. Is there a typical timeline to keep in mind when thinking about short, mid, and long-term outcomes?
There is. That's also something we're going to be getting to in just a little bit. All right, so can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. So here we have another example of a logic model. In this case, we have a more developed logic model with further inputs and activities, outputs and outcomes. Again, in this case, we have inputs such as guest speakers and industry trainers, your activities for career preparation and training programs. So your outputs in this case would be students having completed that training or having developed resumes that they work on as part of the activities. And so the outcomes of that would be their awareness of potential careers in growth industries, in the midterm, having the skills necessary to secure employment, and in the long term, securing sort of a long-term livable wage employment. So next slide, please. So another way of thinking about logic models is to use the reverse approach, to start with the sort of desired outcomes and work backwards to develop activities and inputs. The reverse approach asks the question, but how? As you move from the desired outcomes to identifying the inputs that lead to those outcomes in your logic model. Using a nutrition assistance program as an example, the reverse logic approach here, shown here, starts with the program's long-term outcome of increasing the number of healthy families and works backward to determine how the program will achieve that outcome. So how do you improve family health? You have an increase in families using healthy food practices. How do you increase family food practices? they first need the knowledge of those healthy food choices. How do you get there? Educational workshop series. And what do you need for those inputs? So next slide, please. So next, we're going to work on building a logic model for yourself and go into some of the details of how this is done. So this here is a template available at learn24.dc.gov/funding opportunities. And I'm going to post this in the chat for you all. And hopefully you guys should be able to look at that. If you want to look at this as we're going through this training, then go ahead and click on that link and you'll be able to follow along with what we're doing. So today we're going to be focusing on a comprehensive logic model. So this includes the inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes that we discussed previously, but also a few other components that can help guide the process and provide a better overall picture of your program. This comprehensive model also includes your program's mission statement, the challenge your program hopes to address, the assumptions that guide your program, and what external factors might influence your program success. And so this logic model template is one that your program could use when submitting your grant application. Again, highly recommend checking out the link in the chat to view this slide in a bit more detail. And we're going to be going over the individual components of these over the next few minutes and slides. So next slide, please. So first thing we start with is the broader goals of your program, encapsulated as a mission statement. So as part of this, you will need to note your program's target population and how you hope to impact that population in general terms. So next slide, please. So next, we're going to be focusing on the challenge or problem statement. So this is the specific challenge in the target population that your program is aiming to address. So an effective problem statement will describe the nature of the problem and the difficulties facing the people you serve, is based off current research or authoritative data, is specific and provides measurable indicators or demonstrative proof of the issue's existence, and clearly shows that the need is important. Next slide, please. So to get a better idea of what an effective problem statement looks like, let's compare these two examples. In the stronger example, we can see that the target population and the challenge to be addressed within that problem. This challenge is described in detail using measurable indicators and supported by research, and explains why this challenge is important. And next slide, please. So when developing your own program's problem statement, there are a few other things to consider. Because organizations are so invested in their programs, they can editorialize about the need for the project and sort of what is wrong with society, and then close with a broad statement about how fortunate that your agency exists. We recommend you imagine yourself as the foundation reviewer who is sifting through piles of proposals with similar comments and trying to decipher truth from hyperbole. You can make their job easier by using objective information to verify the need for your programs. Census data, school district test scores, police reports, survey data, research studies, and other similar information legitimize your organization's claim that there is a need. Information can be obtained from your city's planning office, issue-related research organizations such as Kids Count, local universities and colleges, the business or government section of your local library, newspaper articles, internet, whatever you like. Statistics that your organization has gathered related to your proposal are also valuable, as long as they're not distorted. Sometimes quotes from a recognized local or national authority can be used to support your needs statement. And even though sometimes you're citing information that can evoke images of suffering, try to avoid being negative about the problem. Funders are looking for solutions, and your organization's skill in being a part of that solution. And so next slide, please. So next, we're going to be going over how your program will attempt to address the problem that you've identified. The first key component of a logic model is inputs, which we've discussed previously. Again, these are the resources that your program will use to carry out your program's activities: funding, staff, volunteers, etc. And next slide. So our inputs allow us to conduct our activities. Activities, generally referred to as your program activities, are the actions or events provided to generate desired outcomes. When including activities in your logic model, you should also include the dosage, how many of the intervention, like 3 workshops, will students receive. Time will be allocated to a particular activity. So for a hypothetical nutrition assistance program, its activities might include conducting healthy food workshops, hosting Q&A sections with nutritionists, having food preparation training services, taking participants on a site visit to a supermarket, referring participants to food programs and resources. And next slide, please. So activities, again, produce the outputs component of the logic model. Outputs are what a program's specific activities will create or produce, providing evidence of service delivery. And these are described numerically or quantified in some way. For example, outputs associated with that nutrition assistance program might include the specific number of individuals who attended a healthy food workshop, the specific number of individuals who received food preparation training services, or the specific number of individuals who received a referral to food programs and resources. These are the specific sort of measurable things associated with your direct activities and limited in that sense. So next slide, please. So from outputs, we then move to outcomes. Outcomes are the specific changes that may result from a program's activities or the intervention. Programs' activities outcomes fall along a continuum, ranging from short to long-term results. Short-term outcomes are often considered changes in beneficiaries' knowledge, skills, or attitudes. Medium-term outcomes refer to changes in behavior or action that result from the beneficiaries' new knowledge, skills, or attitudes. Long-term outcomes are characterized as changes in condition or status in life that result from those new behaviors or actions. Kevin, if you can advance a little bit along this slide, that would be helpful. It's important to note that describing outcomes as short, medium, or long-term depends on your objectives and the length of the program and the expectations of the program or intervention. What is identified as a long-term outcome for one program could be a medium-term outcome for another. Your logic model should reflect your program's theory of change and the sequence of changes necessary to accomplish your program's long-term results. So using a hypothetical nutrition assistance program again as an example, in the short term, individuals are expected to increase their knowledge of healthy food services. This change in knowledge is expected to lead them to actually adopt healthy food practices, a behavioral change that represents a medium-term outcome. This in turn is expected to lead to an increase in families' overall household food security, sort of the hoped for long-term outcome of the program. Next slide. Kevin, and this one's on you, if you can jump in.
All right, thanks, Tristan. So an area to think about as you're building your logic model are through the youth development outcomes. And the outcomes themselves have either aspects of identity of the youth and aspects of their ability. And so, for example, if this will go, there we go. For aspects of identity, you have many things like belonging and membership. Like, do the youth feel like they belong? They're comfortable. they're excited to be in the program? Do we value their self-awareness, their spirituality? And are they developing skills that are good for their mastery and future as they're moving forward within the program? Those are all the identity components can really kind of be built into everything that Tristan's talking about in regards to your inputs, your activities, the outcomes and the goals, along with the areas of ability, which I'm sure that you're utilizing many of these already within your program and probably are evaluating them in some way as well. And so take that into consideration when you're looking over and building your logic model, and feel free to use many of these terms as well that could be built right in, and it really reflects the great work that you're doing within your programs and the activities that you're providing to youth so they can really come out with strong outcomes in regards to the participation that you're providing in programs as well. And I'll hand it back to you, Tristan.
Thanks, Dan.
Tristan, I think I got a couple questions for you before you move on, if that's okay, for a good time to stop, or you want to?
One more, a little bit, and then we'll get the questions in a couple more slides.
Sounds good.
Kevin, could you advance it? So in summarizing, outcomes are the specific changes that might result from a program's activities or interventions. And these follow along a continuum, ranging from short-term to long-term results. Short-term outcomes are changes in beneficiaries' knowledge, skills, or attitudes. Medium-term outcomes refer to changes in behavior or action that result from that new knowledge, skills, or attitudes. And long-term outcomes are changes in condition or status in life that result from a beneficiary's new behaviors or actions. All right. So what kind of questions do you have?
All right, so the first question is, how many inputs and subsequent related pieces of information like activities, outcomes, etc., make for a strong application? And then I'll answer the follow-up question after that.
All right, Deborah, I think you might be the best person to answer that one.
Okay. So was it how many? Was that the question, Alex? How many inputs?
Yeah, let me read it one more time. How many inputs and subsequent related pieces of information like activities, outcomes, etc., make for a strong application?
This is about the actual logic model and what you should put in your logic model. What you should add to your logic model is what your program does. So it's not necessarily about how many inputs. You should add into your logic model whatever input your program already has in place. So it's not a specific number. It really matters about exactly what you do. And that's what should be in your logic model. Alex, you said there was a follow-up?
Yeah, for comprehensive programming, it is conceivable that more than 15 could be identified, but the application only permits a single-page logic model for submission.
Well, the single-page logic model is because each logic model is related to one program. So since this is for a summer application, they are programmatic and specific to a program. So that's why it would only be for one logic model.
All right. And then must applicants use the logic model template that must use this logic model template to complete their submission or may we use another format that includes the same information? Will points be deducted if we do not use the logic model template that is provided?
Great question, and you can use any logic model template you want. We've seen them in different shapes, and some are in a circle, and some are in the shape of a bear, and whatever you want. However, your organization has created a logic model is perfectly fine. We just have the template for your convenience, but it is not a requirement to use.
All right. And then, so apologies if you're going to cover this soon, but how detailed should the inputs section be regarding, for example, funding for a specific amount be listed, or for staffing, should each position be listed? Thank you.
Tristan, do you want me to take that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So again, this is related, a logic model is related to your program. So it's not about the funding amount. And so there's no place in there where you would add what you're requesting for funding. That goes into your cover page of the application if you are applying for any of the 3 grant opportunities currently out. The logic model doesn't have specific staffing request, but that would be part of the which section? The input section? Is that right, Tristan? Is that where they would put how many people are applying for the program?
Sure. Again, and the goal here is to see the transition from how these inputs will affect the activities. If you can accomplish that, then you're in a good place. Having every single possible input available on there may not be as useful if it's harder to see how those specific inputs directly relate to the activities that you're doing or that you're providing. All righty, let's go on ahead. So let's take a moment again to highlight the differences between outputs and outcomes, as these two are often confused with each other. So on the left side of the slide, you can see that the program outputs are the direct products of a program's activities or services. Outputs quantify the services that were delivered. Program outcomes, on the other side, help quantify the changes a program intends to bring about as a result of a program's activities or intervention. So while outputs are essential elements that enable change, they do not represent benefits or changes in and of themselves. And next slide, please. So think about this statement. Students have developed resumes. Is this statement more likely to be an output or an outcome? I'm going to quickly open. Well, we have our answer.
Sorry about that.
I'll go ahead and close that poll. Seems like we have a good idea. So again, developing resumes would be the direct output of program activities in this case. If you have a workshop on building resumes, then the output of that activity would be those direct resumes. All right, next slide, please. So students decreasing their high-risk sexual behavior. Is this more likely to be an output or an outcome? And again, our poll is open. We'll keep it open for a few more seconds. And closing that down. All right, Kevin, what do we got? So this is an outcome. Specifically, we're talking about like a mid-range outcome because we're talking about a behavioral change as a result of our activities and outputs. So next slide. Students being satisfied with program offerings. Is this more likely to be an output or an outcome? Again, poll is open. All right, I'm going to close this out. So we had a little bit of a back and forth on this one. Kevin, show us our answer, please. So this here is an output. Specifically, it is related to, say, the forms your students would be filling out at the end of the activity or at the end of the program. This is not related to an outcome in terms of special knowledge or behavior or status that you're trying to change on behalf of those students. This is sort of a direct, measurable output of your program activity, which includes, say, them filling out a survey about how satisfied they are. And we'll go on to the next one. The students improving their reading skills and abilities. Is this more likely to be an output or an outcome? And again, our poll is open.
It looks like we made an error on the question or the answers. They both have output as opposed to one outcome and white output.
Oh no. Oops. Well, that's unfortunate. So Kevin, show us our answer, please. This is an outcome. Specifically, it is talking about an increase in knowledge and ability that is sort of the outcome of your program, sort of in the short term, in this case. So we'll check in on questions and such so far. How are we feeling about outcomes and outputs? Any extra questions so far at this point, Alex?
I don't see any questions at the moment. Somebody said they need more practice distinguishing the two. The questions that I see right now are literally just telling us about the output thing, and then also some people chiming in and saying this exercise was helpful to be able to determine the two. So no other questions right now, but feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat and let us know how you feel about the exercise.
And if you have your own questions about a specific example of an output or an outcome and are hoping for clarity there, try that, or you can ask us about it later as well. So next slide, please, Kevin. So next we're going to be going over some details to help you develop your own intended outcome statements for your program. So focusing on the long term, you should be considering how long you're going to be tracking program participants after leaving your program. 6 months, 6 years? Are you going to be tracking them at all? Imagine what your participants are like, a number of months or years after leaving the program. What is their change in status or life condition? And if they got the fullest extent or benefit of your program, what would they have achieved, or what kind of significant change would have occurred? For the midterm, think about the halfway point of your program. So 6 months or so for a 1-year program. And again, specifically think about the behaviors, skills, or actions that you want your participants to be exhibiting. And at that point, where should they be sort of in relation to the long-term outcomes that you're looking for? For short term, you can generally think 0 to 3 months. And specifically right at the end of your program and a little bit after that, what awareness, knowledge, or attitudes you want your participants to gain as a result of your intervention or activities. Next slide, please. So now that we've covered outcomes, we're going to be moving to the final pieces of our comprehensive logic model: assumptions and external factors. So first up, assumptions. These are the beliefs you have about your program, that how you think that change will occur. This is the theory behind your program about why and how it will work. So documenting the assumptions behind a program and behind your logic model is a good way to make implicit assumptions explicit, which can serve to ensure that your staff and stakeholders have a common understanding of how your program is meant to work. There's also kind of the conditions for success, what you need to happen. So for a hypothetical nutrition assistance program, it could be that if people have knowledge of healthier food choices and how to prepare those foods, then they'll make healthier choices. Or if their program is able to bring healthy food options to food deserts and provide nutrition stipends, where needed, it will lead to greater food security for that community. Those are some of the assumptions that are important to your logic model. And next slide. So the last component we're going to be talking about are external factors. These are the factors that influence your ability to do the work that you had planned, and that might influence change in your community or your participants, and also include barriers to achieving the change that you desire. So for our nutrition assistance program, external factors that might affect their success would be the need to convince small grocery stores in the community to carry healthier options, or political or governmental changes might result in a reduction in nutrition stipends that are available. Those are external factors that are outside of your control, but still affect the success of your program. So, next slide, please. So now that we've covered sort of all of the key components of our comprehensive logic model, we're going to look at an example. So this is going to be the logic model for a fictitious organization called The Challenge. They do college and career readiness. So as you can see in their program mission statement, they summarize in broad terms what their target population is, in this case, young adults in Ward 10, and how they hope to impact that population to prepare them for livable wage employment. In their challenge statement, they are specific regarding the nature of the problem and refer to it using measurable indicators. They have 75,000 youth, 3 out of 4 families, that kind of thing. For inputs, you're going to advance ahead, Kevin. They're listing the resources that they require in order to accomplish their activities. And for their activities, advancing again, Kevin, they're listing the specific services that they're intending to have, and as well as the dosage and frequency of those services. For outputs, one more, Kevin, they are listing the direct products of their planned activities. For example, the number of students that completed their college readiness or SAT prep activity, like specifically who went through those activities and how many of them. For outcomes, one more, Kevin. They include short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. For short-term outcomes, there is a focus on knowledge and awareness. For intermediate outcomes, there's a focus on measurable behaviors and actions resulting from those short-term outcomes using indicators such as grades, SAT scores, and college acceptance rates. And for long-term outcomes, they're highlighting the change in their participants' life conditions that will result from the expected intermediate outcomes. So, one more on there, Kevin. So they're also listing the necessary assumptions for their program to function as intended, such as their theory of student success and having adequate access to funding. And at the bottom, one more, Kevin, we're showing the external factors that could negatively affect their program success, such as the possibility of funding reductions and youth dropouts. All right. Kevin, and go ahead and advance. So hopefully at this point, you have a reasonable understanding of how logic models work and how you might be able to develop one for your own program. So an important step in finalizing your logic model is to verify or assess whether the model you've created reflects an appropriate level of detail. Is it plausible? Is it realistic? And is there a consensus among your key stakeholders that the model accurately represents your program? One way to verify that your model meets these criteria is to run it through a series of questions, such as the one shown here on this slide. Does your logic model include all of the key program components? Do the components logically flow? It's also important to consider how realistic your program assumptions are. One thing to note is that it's okay to identify longer-term outcomes for your program, even though it may not be feasible for you to measure the cause and effect relationship between your intervention and your long-term outcomes. In verifying your logic model, it's more important to ask whether it's reasonable to assume that the program can achieve the expected short to long-term outcomes. You should also aim to achieve consensus among your program stakeholders regarding your model and its intended results. You may want to involve other program staff who are not involved in developing the logic model and other external stakeholders to help you verify it. So, one more, Kevin. So, as we're concluding today's presentation, there's a few other things to keep in mind as you're working to develop and use your program logic model. So developing a logic model is not completed in one session or alone by yourself. There is no one best logic model. Logic models represent intention. We want to ensure that logic models reflect planned activities and outcomes and should be supported by an underlying theory of change. In practice, programs may not only operate differently, but also produce unintended results. And an evaluation helps identify how faithfully a program actually adheres to its model. A program logic model isn't static either. It can and should be changed and refined as your program changes and develops. Programs do not need to evaluate, you don't need to evaluate every single aspect of the logic model in evaluations. But logic models play a critical role in informing evaluation and building the evidence base for your program. And one more, Kevin. So, well done, folks. We're just about done with our presentation. So for now, we'd like to ask you something you've learned from today's training. If you can post that in the chat, and alongside that and afterward, we're going to be taking any questions you might have.
All right, Tristan, I got a question while people post in the chat with one thing that they learned. Will there be will there need to be one version for virtual and one for in-person, or may we require, each may require different resources based on the pre-existing conditions? And this is a question, I'm guessing, about how many logic models are necessary for completion.
Deborah, I think you might be more equipped to answer that.
Sure. So, hi, everybody. Sorry, that. This would be, you would still be using one logic model, because the difference between what you're providing virtually and in person might change for your activities and your inputs, but it shouldn't be changing for anything else. So if you can include, because it's still the same program, it's just the way that you are offering it. So if you can include those, if there are large changes and differences between it, then you might want to indicate that on your logic model in the input and activity section.
All right, great. Let's see what other question. I don't see any other questions, but I do see a lot of responses to your question. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna actually start reading them out. And what different things that people have learned today. So we learned that an output is not an outcome. We also learned, somebody else learned the difference between an output and an outcome. Logic models and your program should be solution oriented. The actual structure and use of the logic model. The difference between output and outcome. Thank you for defining the sections. The output/outcome section was very helpful. This is very helpful to understand how to put together logic models. I had not used them at all in the past, and all this makes sense. Learning how to distinguish between outcomes and outputs. Participants, for example, participants' enjoyment of activities are output. The short, mid, and long-term outcomes are determined by the program. Short-terms are outcomes are immediate. Long-term outcomes are changes seen over an extended period of time.
Great. I'm going to open up the poll.
Oh, okay, cool.
So just if you can let us know how comfortable you feel about logic models after today's training, that'd be helpful for us. If you have questions about logic models still, we're all available to, we're here to help. It's as easy for you as we can. We also have a evaluation for this, which I will post in the chat, which would be helpful for anyone to let us know how to do. And I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. It looks like most of you are feeling much more on the very comfortable side of things, and we're very happy to hear that.
You have a question for you, Tristan. Is there a point of contact that we can contact if we need support after this training is over?
I'd say myself or Deborah are probably the most likely ones for that. Yeah. Deborah, sound good to you?
Absolutely. They can always contact me, or also Learn24 at dc.gov. Great place to send any questions. I don't see the evaluation link.
Sent it to all attendees.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Tristan. That was great.
Yes, thank you, Tristan.
I hope this was helpful for everybody. And if you have any questions, again, just let us know. Email at us at learn24@dc.gov.